When we look at a playoff team's roster, we can split the players into two categories. The first category contains players who are not likely to overperform or underperform in the playoffs, in the sense that you can expect them to do in the playoffs what they've done in the regular season. PJ Tucker is a great example. You kind of know what to expect from him. But then there's a second type of player that makes them a little bit more unpredictable. And this unpredictability is a double-edged sword. Perhaps they go unaccounted for or underestimated in the opponent's scouting reports. Or perhaps their own team builds a scheme centered around them and they fail to perform and then the whole thing collapses. These are players we like to think of as X factors. Now, it's pretty much always the case that the best player on each team is basically an X factor. But to make this video more interesting, I've purposely removed the best player from each team as a potential candidate. So here we're talking about third options, fourth options, even some bench players. And that's the criteria. Now, before we get into it, I'd like to give a big shout out to SeatGeek for being the beautiful ticket selling app that it is, for saving us time and money when buying tickets, and for sponsoring this video and paying my college tuition. SeatGeek is an app that I think everybody in North America should have, because unless you're gonna plan to live your life as a hermit, sooner or later you're going to want to go to some sort of event, whether that be an NBA game or a football game or a concert. And when that time comes, SeatGeek is the place you'll need to go to buy those tickets in a stress-free environment. I've used SeatGeek multiple times myself to go to Ravens games in Baltimore as well as Wizards games in DC. And I've also recommended to friends whenever they mention that they might go to some concert or game in the future. So if you don't have SeatGeek already, you should download it right now and you can use my promo code MDJ for $20 off of your first purchase. Okay, we're gonna do the Eastern Conference first and then the Western Conference, starting from the bottom. So, with the Detroit Pistons, their X factor is Wayne Ellington. Ellington was a mid-season pickup for Detroit and he's been pretty good. For a team that ranks in the bottom 10 in the league in three-point percentage, Detroit desperately needs his shooting. Ellington is someone you can run off screens the same way you would for a guy like JJ Redick, and his off-ball movement adds a level of dynamism to this Pistons offense. In the playoffs, Blake Griffin will likely face double teams on occasions, at which point it's crucial for him to make the right pass and for Ellington and Bullock and Kennard to make their shots. Out of those three, Ellington is the veteran with playoff experience, so he's my X factor. Onto the Orlando Magic with Terrence Ross. I considered putting Jonathan Isaac here, but recent news suggests that Isaac is questionable for the playoffs, so I went with Ross. This is similar to Wayne Ellington and Detroit. Ross is Orlando's best three-point shooter. Early in the season, he struggled a bit, but towards the end of the season, his scoring really picked up the pace. When you look at Orlando's roster, you know what you're going to get from Vucevic and Fournier and DJ Augustine, but not with Ross. He could shoot 6 of 10 from 3 and swing the game, or 1 of 7 from 3 and bomb the game. The Brooklyn Nets, their X factor is Caris LeVert. First off, it's great to see that Caris LeVert has recovered pretty decently well from his injury early on in the season. One issue that Brooklyn has is generating offense. Now, Kenny Atkinson's offense contains a lot of ball movement and it's a pretty modern, kind of spread the floor pace type of offense. But the issue is, no matter how smooth your offense is, you still need people who can drive into the lane, who can collapse the defense and generate open shots for the people around you. Much of that responsibility has been placed on D'Angelo Russell. And given the types of shots that D'Angelo Russell likes to take, there will be games in the playoffs where he shoots poorly. And in those instances, the Nets really have to hope that Dinwiddie and LeVert can carry the offense. I think Dinwiddie is also an X factor, but with LeVert's play style, I think he has a bigger upside and a bigger downside. The Indiana Pacers, Thaddeus Young. With this pick, I'm in part looking at their first round matchup against the Celtics. The Celtics are not a great rebounding team on either end of the floor. I think there's room for Young to do some damage there. Also, in terms of matchups, the Celtics have a lot of ball handlers on the perimeter, not counting Kyrie. Thaddeus Young could very well end up guarding Brown and Tatum and Hayward and Marcus Morris and Kyrie on different possessions. If you flip that around, he'll be guarded by those guys too. Young is an underrated post player and he could see some action down there. On to the Boston Celtics, Jason Tatum. With Marcus Smart out for the playoffs, Jason Tatum becomes even more important. Now, I've already talked about Jason Tatum and how he's had a bit of a disappointing regular season. And if you want to learn more about that, you can watch my previous video. But the playoffs are a different environment. Tatum last year was awesome, especially against Philadelphia. And generally speaking, in the playoffs, players who have a lot of offensive talent are usually allowed to take tougher shots because in the playoffs, you often have to do so more often than you would in a regular season. And that's something that Tatum is certainly willing to do. Now, whether or not he'll make it could very well decide Boston's fate. The Philadelphia 76ers, Ben Simmons. In a playoff series, both teams have a lot of time, a lot of games to try to figure each other out. And if you're the opponent and you're looking at a team like the Sixers, and you specifically look at their starting lineup and you think how to defend them, so you're looking at Redick, Butler, Simmons, Tobias Harris, and Embiid, there's really only one weak link offensively in that lineup, and that's Ben Simmons and specifically his shooting. That's the one thing where you look at it and you go, okay, I can exploit this as a defensive team. We've seen time and time again how not being able to shoot as a perimeter player will drastically hinder you in the playoffs compared to in the regular season. Now granted, out of all those players who can't shoot, Ben Simmons is one of the best at doing everything else. But still, you are going to expect teams to try very unique things when defending Ben Simmons. And that alone makes Ben Simmons the X factor. The Toronto Raptors, Marc Gasol. In the 20 or so games that Gasol has played with the Raptors, we've learned that his role on the team is not scoring. He no longer takes the post fadeaways and running hooks that he did in Memphis. Many games he has more assists than points, and that seems to be enough. In fact, that seems to make him slightly better than Ibaka. It was interesting that in the recent overtime game against Miami, Gasol played instead of Ibaka. I don't know if that will continue in the playoffs. One thing that Ibaka has over Gasol is mobility. Now, depending on the matchup, Gasol might not be able to play much. In their first round matchup against Orlando, for instance, if Vucevic starts hitting too many outside shots, Ibaka may have to come in. And furthermore, how will Gasol defend Brook Lopez if Milwaukee and Toronto meet in the conference finals? Speaking of which, the Milwaukee Bucks, Eric Bledsoe. This decision was made between Bledsoe and Brook Lopez. With Lopez, the question is how well he can shoot from three, and also how can he comfortably stay in the paint on defense, or will the other team exploit that strategy? But Bledsoe is more interesting to me. With Malcolm Brogdon out with no definitive timetable, Bledsoe becomes much more valuable. Some games, Bledsoe plays like an all-NBA guard, and other times he looks overpaid. Which Bledsoe are we gonna get? If Milwaukee and Boston meet in the second round, can Bledsoe take advantage of being guarded by Kyrie or vice versa? All right, now let's move on to the West. The 8th seed, Clippers, their X factor, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Let's be honest, the Clippers don't have any shot at beating the Warriors. So for me personally, the only interesting thing about this series is I want to see how well SGA will do in the playoffs as a rookie. Outside of that, Lou Williams is kind of the physical embodiment of what you would think of as an X factor, although arguably he is the best player on this team. So the 7th seed San Antonio Spurs, their X factor, Marco Bellinelli. This seems like a long time ago, but in last year's playoffs in the first round, Heat versus Sixers, Bellinelli was instrumental in winning at least 2 of those games for Philadelphia. Bellinelli would be considered a spot-up shooter, but when you look at the types of shots this guy sometimes takes and the degree of difficulty, he's also a shot creator in a very unique way. The Spurs are interesting in that they are number 1 in the league in three-point percentage and bottom 5 in attempts. From just a statistical standpoint, they should be shooting more threes, since their threes are much more efficient than their twos. Bellinelli is the guy on this roster that could really tip the scales. OKC, Dennis Schroeder. OKC's biggest weakness as a team is that they can't shoot, plain and simple, which means that they often have trouble creating offense and just scoring despite an MVP caliber season from Paul George. Dennis Schroeder actually has a respectable track record in the playoffs. Now, much of this hinges on his very unstable jumper. If opponents have to respect this shot, it creates opportunities for him to use his quickness to get into the lane and create offense for others. Without that, OKC will eventually devolve into Paul George, Westbrook, your turn, my turn, and they're not going to win enough games playing like that. The Utah Jazz, Jay Crowder. Looking at their first round matchup against Houston, Crowder will spend a lot of time guarding James Harden because I don't think Mitchell will have the energy to do that and carry the offense, and Crowder's already looking for advice from Patrick Beverley, so there you go. Obviously, guarding Harden is a team effort, but the first point of contact is always the most important. Crowder is again another player whose three-point shot comes and goes, which makes his impact potentially hugely positive and hugely negative. Houston, Eric Gordon. Every team that will go up against the Rockets will first have to think about what to do with Harden. In fact, that might be what they spend 95% of their time talking about, and that's probably appropriate. Harden will see all types of weird defensive schemes, I have no doubt. Random double teams to force the ball out of his hands, zone defenses, like what Bledsoe did in the recent matchup where he just stayed on Harden's left side. And even when Harden doesn't have the ball, the guy defending him will probably just stick right next to him so that he doesn't get the ball. All of this to say, it leaves room for Harden's teammates to do something offensively. Now, we've seen what Chris Paul can do in the playoffs. If he doesn't get injured, he'll show up and he'll be awesome. We've seen less from Eric Gordon. Last year in the playoffs, there were many games where he scored 20 plus. Many other games, he struggled to break double digits. The Portland Trailblazers and their X factor is Enes Kanter. With Nurkic out, Portland doesn't have many options at center. We all know Kanter and his weakness in the playoffs, dating back to his days with OKC. He is so limited in terms of his defensive mobility that it makes it difficult to play him in the playoffs, especially when he's going up against so many elite Western Conference guards. But in the first round against his former team, a team that actually doesn't have a lot of shooting and has a really big dude in the middle named Steven Adams, Portland can and might just have to play Kanter more than they like to. And if that's the case, Kanter could be Portland's weakness, or he could be a necessary evil that perhaps even turns into a strength. The Denver Nuggets, Paul Millsap. Statistically, it may seem as if Millsap this year took a huge step back. Now, Millsap certainly has been declining because of his age, but I'd argue that decline is less so than it seems on paper when you just look at numbers. Because a lot of this has to do with Denver's changing scheme, as well as the emergence of not only Jokic, but more importantly, Denver's young, talented guards. With that being said though, Millsap is by far the player with the most amount of playoff experience on this roster. He's still a pretty good one-on-one player matched up against slow big men or small guards, and I can very well see him slipping through the cracks of the opponent team's scouting report as they figure out how to stop Jokic and Murray and everyone else before they remember the former All-Star. And finally, the Golden State Warriors, Draymond Green. Every year, Draymond is the Warriors' X factor because you know Durant and Curry and Clay will do what they've always done in the playoffs. Draymond, however, is a little bit different. Is he going to get himself into foul trouble? Is he going to shoot close to 40% from three like he's done before? Or about 30% from three, which he's also done before? Is he going to kick LeBron in the balls? Oh, wait. Yeah, I guess that's not gonna happen. Anyways, those are my picks for each NBA playoff team's X factor heading into the 2019 playoffs. If you have any thoughts, feel free to leave them down. Blah, blah, blah. If you have any thoughts, feel free to leave them down in the comments section below, and I will see you next video pretty soon because we are in the best part of the NBA season, the part that actually matters, which are the playoffs. So, happy playoffs, everybody, and I'll see you soon.